of the Taipei Liaison Office in Cape Town, our sponsor of this series. Our guest speakers, Judge Albie Sachs, Luanda Tazo, and Shirley Gunn, trustees of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centers, scholars from around the world, and all of you who have signed in. My name is Heather Blumenthal, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. Welcome everyone to the second part of our discussion forum, exploring the impossibilities of a comparative approach to transitional justice. Last week, we spoke about Taiwan, its multi-layered colonial history, and the difficulties it encounters in implementing transitional justice domestically. In today's forum, we are going to talk about the TRC in South Africa, how it operated, as well as possible differences between how Taiwanese scholars view the TRC and how South African experts evaluate it today. This four-part webinar series was researched, organized, and will be moderated by Alexander Novakovic, our intern from the Austrian Service Abroad. Alex is studying Sinology, Modern Chinese Studies at the University of Vienna, and is currently writing his master's thesis on transitional justice in Taiwan. Before I hand over to Alex, for the duration of the talk, all cameras and audio will be switched off. Should you have any comments or questions, please type them in the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your screen. Alex, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Heather, for that kind introduction. So the reason why I had this idea of sort of organizing a forum like that is because my first encounter with the TRC was actually through the research of sort of Taiwanese scholars who look at the TRC. And after I came to South Africa, I realized that the picture I had from South Africa through that research and the picture I was seeing with my own eyes didn't really align very well. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to three speakers today who will help me and all of us get a clearer understanding of what the TRC was about. So I welcome Albie Sachs, who almost doesn't need an introduction. He's a former anti-apartheid activist. He served as a High Justice in the Constitutional Court of South Africa, appointed by Mandela, and played an instrumental role during the negotiations that made South Africa a constitutional democracy. He's also the mentor of our second speaker, Luanda Tazo, who is a trustee of the Constitutional Court, a member of the Constitutional Hill Trust, and the founder of Including Society. She's also the author of a book she published 2 years ago called Made in South Africa, Black Woman Stories of Rage, Resistance, and Progress. Our third speaker who will join them is Shirley Gunn. She's the Executive Director of the Human Rights Media Center based in Cape Town, and also the chairperson of the SACTJ, the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice. Thank you to the three of you to join our discussion today. And our discussion will consist of three parts. The first, Albie is going to give a little presentation and provide us with general background information, give us an introductory statement for about 15 minutes. Then we're going to talk about the achievements and failures of the TRC process. And in the last part, we're going to talk about tasks which still remain open in today's South Africa. After this 60-minute discussion, we will also have 30 minutes time for a Q&A where our audience can interact with our speakers through the chat. Albie, the stage is yours.
Well, hello everybody, and maybe a particular hello to my friends in Taiwan, where I've been a number of times. And I've even had an asteroid named after me in Taiwan by one of the science universities there. I've spoken on a number of occasions there about our Truth Commission, and it's a great pleasure to see that the discussion has been broadened today. And you know, Alex, you mentioned the disjuncture between what you read and what you experience. And I think they're both correct, and it's very important. There were huge achievements. In some ways, it was a magnificent enterprise, but there are also huge defaults. And it's understandable that today the people are concerned with the defaults. What could have been done better? What was done badly? So both, you don't have to disregard what you read, but you have to bear in mind the two sides. The story for me starts in 1993. We still had an apartheid government. De Klerk was the president of South Africa. Parliament was a white racist parliament with small subaltern groups for people of mixed descent, and Indians, black people completely excluded. And the National Executive Committee of the ANC is meeting near Johannesburg and having a very heated debate. 80 members, I'm one of them, one of the lawyers on the National Executive Committee. And the issue is what to do about a report that had been commissioned by the ANC into gross violations of human rights by the ANC itself in camps in Angola. And the report had said that our people, I'm using the language of the time, had treated captives in a very cruel way, a way that violated the spirit and the values of the ANC. There was prima facie evidence that had happened, and the ANC leadership must take appropriate steps to hold those accountable to account. And some people were arguing, we must follow, we've heard what they've said, and others were saying you've got to understand the circumstances. There was civil war in Angola at the time, young people, no training, and eventually the decision was made that it's not for the ANC alone to examine its own violations of human rights. The bigger picture is violations by the regime over a long period of time, and that should be done after democracy, after we get elections. And Professor Carter Asmal said, what we need, comrades, is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So he introduced the theme into our discussions, and we took a decision in principle. After democracy, we would have a Truth Commission. So ironically, the Truth Commission emerged not to examine the grounds of apartheid, but to examine the initial kickstart, the failures of the ANC itself. And I might mention that one of my most, to my mind, important legal tasks was to help write a code of conduct for the ANC while in exile to forbid the use of torture, because it was a matter of grave concern to many of us. So that's the first point of departure for our Truth Commission. The second was, I'm in London and I'm reporting on our progress. We're going to have elections quite soon, and I'm staying in a very small hotel in King's Cross, and knock on the door. Sorry to disturb you so late, but we've received an urgent fax from ANC headquarters in Johannesburg. And I'm given the fax, and it reads that the generals who'd been in command of South African security forces were saying that de Klerk had promised them an amnesty. They look at the constitution, there's no amnesty. They didn't say we're going to have a coup. They said we're going to resign, we're going to leave the country. Why should we go to jail for what we did for our political masters? Because we're helping to get democracy in place. And they were helping because they knew of right-wing plots to destroy the elections. So I turned that piece of paper over and wrote what we must do. We can't give a general amnesty. We can say if each person comes forward to tell the truth, then they can get amnesty. Linking that up with what the ANC wanted for itself. So this is important to remember. Our TRC was really based on truth for amnesty, was a core element. It's very specific. Each country has its own pains, its own violations, its own anxieties that need to be dealt with. And this became central to the structure of our Truth Commission, because it wasn't one body, it was three separate bodies. The one to hear the stories of the violations. It traveled around the country. It did extraordinary work. It did work of immense value to the country. The second commission was to grant amnesty. That was more legal. It had two judges. It wasn't just lay people. And the third section of the commission was reparations. In my overall view, the first commission did astonishing work. It went into the communities. The people wept, they cried, they told their stories, and there was huge public involvement and engagement. And that can be done anywhere in the world. That public acknowledgement, the phenomenological side, the experiential side, is vital. It's not the report that matters so much. It's that sense of the nation participating in re-examining its past in a very expressive, almost theatrical way. The second, by and large, the amnesties that were given, they weren't very large in number. Amnesty was given to the killers of Chris Hani or to the killer of Steve Biko, but some other ghastly people got amnesty if they met the criteria. There's certain complaints about that. The third section was reparations. And my feeling is that was the weakest of all three. It was slow. It only gave a small amount of money. It wasn't done in a gracious, generous way. And the focus shouldn't have been on money. We had separate sections. You didn't come and tell the truth to get payment for compensation. It wasn't like that at all. You told the truth because you wanted the truth to be known of what had happened to you, and in the case of the violators, what they'd done. But it ended up being focused on money for a certain number of people. It wasn't enough. It wasn't done graciously. Other people were left out who should have been paid, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that later. But the main failure was the focus on reparation should have been on the human heart, on getting communities involved, on doing symbolical reparative acts. Reparation shouldn't be seen as you somehow are paid out for what you'd suffered and now it's over. And I think that was the biggest failure of the Truth Commission. And the three other quick lasting points. Part of its value. There's no scope for denial. The killers and torturers themselves have come forward to speak about the cruelty. Apartheid wasn't just unjust and inhuman in itself. To be carried out, it required brutal methods, very important for combating denialism. Its biggest value was what an American professor called converting knowledge into acknowledgement. We knew about the deaths in detention. We knew about the tortures, but these were statistics. Through the Truth Commission, the acknowledgement came of the pain of those who suffered, some acknowledgement for those who did terrible things, an acknowledgement of a national responsibility, not just the particular individuals who were involved. The last points to make, the very important people managing the Truth Commission be independent, impartial people who are not running for office, who are not trying to get electoral advantage, not trying to score points. And we had Archbishop Tutu and many other figures, Yasmin Suka, many others. That's absolutely vital for any Truth Commission. They are not neutral. You're not neutral on pain, injustice, torture. You are passionate about those things, but you're neutral in giving everybody an equal hearing, listening, and having multiple dimensions of the whole issue. The final point is that the Truth Commission cannot in itself rectify the injustices and the inequalities that systemically continue afterwards. And that's not its role. That's not its role. Its role is to deal with acutely painful episodes that were particularly injurious, that were even under the existing apartheid law unlawful, for them to come out in the case of those of us on the ANC side, we don't come into the country, the new democracy, with secrets, with suppressed things. We also have to own up to our own particular violations. What was important then, when the Truth Commission functioned, was the time of everybody voting for the first time, a sense of the country moving forward. And it was the vote that helped to carry the country forward, not the Truth Commission. What the Truth Commission did was to remove certain, as I say, very intense, very ugly features of the past, to get them acknowledged, and to get the nation, as far as possible, to feel these things must never happen again. And we all bear responsibility in one way or another for ensuring it doesn't happen again. These are the transportable lessons, as far as I'm concerned. At the same time, we also have to learn, and Taiwan has to learn about our failures, which I'm sure the other speakers will speak about based on their own experiences in a very, very valid way.
Thank you, Albie, for that wonderful, short and concise introduction. I think the fact that you just said that the TRC sort of had to focus on these gross human rights violations is very important, because now in this whole field of transitional justice, there is this tendency to connect transitional justice to all kinds of political issues. It has to do with decolonization, it has to do with language, with land issues. But every political subject is talked about under this umbrella of transitional justice. And I think it's now time that after the never-ending expansion of this field to actually come back to a concise definition of what transitional justice actually is. So I think this was very important. Let me ask you one more question. So when political scientists look at this negotiated democratization in South Africa, they say usually you have a political constellation where you have on the government or regime side reactionary forces and reformist forces, whereas on the opposition side you have moderates and radicals. And the only way for such a democratization to succeed, for such negotiations to succeed, is when reformers and moderate forces can reach an agreement, while both of them need to marginalize the extreme in their own party. So could you maybe elaborate a bit on that? So how did the National Party succeed in marginalizing their far right wing? And how did the ANC succeed in sort of bringing all the people who maybe at the beginning wanted to seek revenge to actually embark on this journey on reconciliation?
Okay, first of all, your thesis is wrong. W-R-O-N-G, wrong. And that was proved in Northern Ireland, where it was always the moderates who got to get together. And nothing came of it. It was when Sinn Féin, the rebels, the bombers, got together with the unionists, when the ex-prisoners on both sides got together, that you got the breakthrough. The moderates were saying nothing was clear. So you've got to get the combatants involved. That was the heart of it. And in our case, I don't know what I would be. I was a revolutionary, a moderate revolutionary or revolutionary moderate. You could call it what you like. We had intense discussions on our side. Many, many people were skeptical. I would often argue, say, we have to look at every proposal from the enemy. We use the word the enemy with two eyes. One is it a breakthrough or is it a trap? And half the people now said it's a trap. I'm saying it's a breakthrough because I'm looking for something. It wasn't that simple, moderate things. The biggest victory of the whole negotiation process was getting the right wing Afrikaners who weren't even in the National Party. We had 40,000 white men with guns, half in the army, half outside, waiting for the command from Constant Viljoen to take over. They had plans to seize us all, fly us up to UNITA territory in Angola and say, now get your solution, but make sure there's an Afrikaner Volksstaat in it. And very late in the day, we got them on board. Very late in the day, we got the Inkatha Freedom Party on board a few days before the elections. So that was the ultimate victory of the negotiations. You can't divide it into this simple idea of the good people on the one side and the extremists on the other. We did notice inside the National Party a clear division. And fairly early on, Rolf Meyer stood out and Leon Wessel stood out. And Davy de Villiers, who was a Springbok rugby captain, he was a wonderful person trying very, very hard. But some of the others, Pick Water, always cast as a moderate. He would come into a meeting, and he'd go out. He made no progress at all. So you wanted thoughtful people looking for solutions for the country and to get as much as they could for their sides. For me, that was important. And the big thing was to get what you would call the extremists into negotiations, rather than to say we must come up with a solution and then carry on without them. So it's a very rich, textured process. And Chris Hani was assassinated. We had rolling mass action. There were breakdowns. There was a mutiny in Bophuthatswana, killings in Bishu, the Bophuthatswana massacre. It was a very, very rough process. It wasn't rational people getting together, moderates on both sides, and then we get everybody else in. And that's a story that really needs to be told, a very, very exciting story.
Well, thank you for debunking our first myth in this forum. So negotiation processes are obviously much more complicated. Luando, should we continue with you? Yeah, so Albie obviously already mentioned some of the achievements and failures, but would you like to sort of elaborate on this?
Yeah, I mean, similarly for me, my awareness of the TRC was when it started. So for Albie, it was before it started, but for me as a little kid, I think one of the successes is that it was everywhere. It was on radio, it was on TV, and even though as a young child, I didn't quite understand its depth, it was in front of me. And I grew up with it, that even though I wasn't connected to it, I remember as I grew older thinking, I need to go back to that moment and understand it better because something significant happened there. The TRC for me was the first time I saw Black people visibly emotional and breaking down and crying. The Black people in my life had never done that before. Even in the hardest circumstances, there was always composure. We were always stoic. And this time around, it felt like a floodgate of emotions had just opened. And for a little kid, that was scary because it sort of, it shook my world and everything that I knew. But also at the same time, it allowed me to reckon with Black emotion. And even through my parents, you know, I think the only time I had seen that was when Chris Hani died. There was a couple of years before, I remember seeing an emotion, but it scared me. Whereas the TRC emotion didn't really scare me, it made me curious. And I knew I wanted to know more about it. There was a pain to it that I had never seen before. And I have Antie's book here, and she talks about, for me, this crying is the beginning of the Truth Commission, the signature tune and definitive moment, the ultimate sound of what the process is about. And she says that experts talk about how pain kills language. And I think South Africa needed that because we are talkers. There's always a lot of thinking and intellectualizing. And for me, the crying, seeing the crying, it was important for us to reckon with emotion. It was cathartic. So I would say in that sense, it was a success. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight also in the book is she talks about...
Luando, just one quick question. Can you just briefly explain to our audience, who is not only from South Africa, who is Ankie Krag?
Oh, during the TRC, she was a journalist. So she was an Afrikaans journalist who would report on the TRC, and ultimately her reporting culminated in this book, Country of My Skull, which I think every South African should read. And because she's also a poet, the way she writes about the TRC is just so rich. There's such a deep human understanding of what happened in that moment. And for me, this book is it's my lifelong partner, basically. I refer to it quite a lot.
This is also one of the first books I read about the TRC, and it also opened my eyes to a lot of issues. What I find so amazing, or so interesting and almost touching about her book is that Ankie doesn't pretend to understand everything. She reports and she asks questions, and she almost bombs you with all these questions and all these moral dilemmas, and you have to cope with them yourself.
And she's trying to cope through them as well. It seems
Yes.
like in real time you're with her. And one of the interesting things she notes in the book is how a lot of Afrikaner journalists were involved in the reporting of the TRC, that it was almost a compensation for the guilt that they felt, that they wanted to immerse themselves in what happened. So I think that is a very interesting observation. I wasn't aware of it at the time. The other thing that I want to convey as a success is she has a conversation with her colleague, Mondli, and he says, for me, justice lies in the fact that everything is laid out on the same table. The truth that rules our fears, our deeds, and our dreams is coming to light. From now on, you don't only see a smiling Black man in front of you, but you also know what I carry inside of me. I've always known it. Now you also know. I'll just leave it there. I think that's a powerful expression of the meaning of the TRC beyond reparations, beyond its shortcomings, that you know what I carry inside of me.
Okay, so on the one side, finally, Black people being able to show their pain and their emotions and being allowed to speak, and on the other side, the whole society being able to see this.
And can I just add that
Yes.
I think part of the success of the TRC are also those who didn't forgive. I think at the time it felt as if to be a good victim, you had to accept the apology. And I remember watching the clip of the Mtimkulu family, and they were being told what happened to Simphiwe Mtimkulu, and they never forgave. And for me, it's to say that to be a part of a community and a country, you don't have to forgive. You can coexist. And you can still live in this country not having forgiven. And I think seeing that alternative path of opting out of the forgiveness narrative, if you like, is an important moment.
Yeah. So the topic of forgiveness. I would like to ask you one question about something that Albie earlier talked about. He talked about how you cannot be neutral in such a in working in such a commission. You cannot be neutral on human rights issues. And so in Taiwan, this neutrality of their own Transitional Justice Commission has been a topic of great debate, because shortly after the Transitional Justice Commission in Taiwan was set up, there was a scandal. So one of the younger members leaked an internal discussion where commissioners in that commission said, okay, now finally we have a commission, finally we have now an instrument to get rid of the other party. And then after she leaked that, the whole thing blew up. The head of the commission had to resign. And after that, many scholars obviously criticized the TJC and said this is only a political instrument for one party, not interested in reconciliation. And when Taiwanese scholars speak about a neutral, unbiased TRC, they usually mention the South African one because obviously you had black and white commissioners. There was a long process of selecting the commissioners. The commissioners were not paid by the government. So Tutu was paid by the church, Borain by corporations. And Tutu even, there's this anecdote of Tutu threatening to resign after the ANC said, we don't want you to talk about certain issues. And this is sort of used to say the TRC was very neutral and there was no bias in the TRC towards any party. Would you agree to this statement?
Before I answer that, one thing I do also want to highlight as a success of the TRC, I mean, it's an extension of the first point that, you know, freedom fighters would often use the courtroom as their way of putting apartheid on trial. There was a strategy around the things you would say in a courtroom because you knew it would be covered. And I think similarly, the TRC domain offered victims a political arena as well for them to express their politics, but also to express deep moral questions. And one of those questions is, how is it possible that the person I love so much lit no spark of humanity in you? In so many ways, that's a question we're still living with, just in terms of our human relations. So I think the wisdom of the victims, they were not just victims in a sense of not having agency. I think they didn't just cry. I think also in the moral and very human questions that they brought up, it helped to even humanize us. And I think that for me, those questions are still pertinent today. In terms of bias, I mean, I think Albie would know more about this than me. From what I've read, there hasn't been any known political biases. And as you've highlighted with even the ANC, where people thought maybe Tutu would be sympathetic to the ANC, that really wasn't the case. But I think lately what happened is when Winnie Mandela died, they kept playing a clip between Tutu and Winnie. And they tried to say that Tutu had some kind of personal vendetta against Winnie Mandela. But if you watch the whole clip, it was really part of this misinformation that goes around today where people want to create conspiracy theories and believe what they want to believe. Because I don't, knowing what I've read about the TRC and having watched that full clip, the impression that was created, how they tried to paint Tutu was really unfair.
I find it very difficult sometimes to get sort of a whole picture of the TRC because some of the publication, especially from the late 90s, are obviously also politically motivated. So I try to, you know, get information from everywhere I can, but it's very difficult for me, not knowing who the people are who wrote this.
Yeah, people are
clipping
things and using them to their own advantage to tell their own stories for their own agendas.
But sort of two things I picked up in that criticism of the TRC being biased. One criticism was that the selection of victims was biased and that they said they selected rather victims who were victims of the police force rather than ANC violence, which also happened. And the fact that I think Buthelezi and the IFP did sort of rejected to participate at the TRC because they saw it as biased.
So I definitely have that under my shortcomings in terms of also the apartheid officials who didn't participate. And also, as we know, to the extent that F.W. de Klerk participated, that it wasn't as open as we would have liked it to be. So I think in terms of certain army generals and all of those kinds of people, the absence from the commission, I really think took away from what it could have been. And also some people saying, extraterritorial actors like the companies, the American companies specifically, who participated in the apartheid regime by supplying arms and all sorts of things. The fact that that wasn't present in the TRC, some people mark it as a shortcoming.
Okay, I would like to ask you one another question. So in Taiwan, at the beginning, when the TJC was set up, there was this whole slogan for a very long time: truth leads to justice and justice leads to reconciliation. Yeah. Today, basically nobody believes that anymore. But even in transitional justice research, there is not really an understanding of when do certain truths sort of lead to reconciliation and when do certain truths polarize. So what I found so interesting about Enki Krauh's book is that she is listing one ambiguous story after another. So I will just read something for our audience just to understand. And usually these ambiguous stories are in other countries the topic of great dispute. For example, in Poland and Hungary, collaboration to the Holocaust is a topic that is still very controversial until today. So Anki, her book is full of these stories, you know, the narrative of betrayal, people selling out their friends, resistance fighters betraying the resistance movement or being abandoned by the resistance movement, the narrative of co-responsibility through inaction. Yeah, Anki asks in that book, why is it that it seems like a lot of Black people during this TRC process pretend as if they would all have been part of the anti-apartheid struggle, whereas most of them were not. The narrative of a victim perpetrator, so obviously the human rights violations, which were also committed by the ANC, as well as also very ambiguous, the narrative of a perpetrator victim that pops up in the second book of a trilogy of someone who was in the South African Defense Force and who was traumatized by hearing what he actually did during the TRC hearings. So usually in any other country, any one of these narratives is enough to create this whole controversy. Why was it possible in South Africa to talk about all these very controversial subjects so easily?
An interesting chapter in the book, or a figure that I find interesting, is someone like Joe Mamasela, right? And Anki talks about going to meet with him. They meet at the Carlton Center Hotel. And he says, he talks of himself as a political hostage. And he doesn't see himself as someone who betrayed his people. He said, we had tough choices. The reason why those people on Robben Island are seen as heroes is because, unlike me, they were not given a choice of whether to be an informer or to go to prison. I made a choice that was presented in front of me. And also he seemed to have the sense that the people that we consider to be heroes are not heroes, that they're no holy cows, that they've also had to make some incredibly hard decisions. And as an example, he says, I don't know if he says it or Anki talks to a Black journalist who says, you know what, all of us know what funded the struggle in South Africa. We know that the ANC's money came from gun running and drugs, right? And he says white people are breaking these news stories from the TRC, not knowing that Black people are shaking their heads because we know. And we know more than you think we know, kind of thing. So I think the reason why there was a lot of ambiguity in terms of the complexity of who's a victim, who's a perpetrator, is the fact that the way Black people had to live their lives, under apartheid, required some moral compromise. I worked for Justice Cameron, and he has this thing about our heroes are men of contradiction, men and women of contradiction and compromise. And he says we mustn't overlook the cost of the compromise because perhaps it was a necessity. So you needed a moral pliability to be able to survive. I think Black people really know what it's like to walk that tightrope, right, of living in such a corrupt system, trying to make moral choices, but for your own survival, you have to do certain things. Joe Mamasela puts that across and says, I don't see myself as someone who betrayed my people. I'm a political hostage. A lot of people viewed themselves in that way, that the choices were really lousy. that people could make. So in that sense, we even understood why maybe the ANC would have taken money from sources that aren't really the cleanest to be able to achieve the outcomes. So when this complexity comes out in the TRC, we knew it's the stuff that we talk about in the township. It wasn't a bombshell. And I'm not saying, I'm not, by the way, saying it's a truth, but ANC money came from gun running and drugs. It's just that people, have a sense of knowing that not everyone in the struggle was perfect, that some people made moral compromises. We were willing to overlook that and forgive that because we understand what the end was for that.
This is quite.
So there's a lot of ambiguity there, and I think that requires a lot of maturity to hold those tensions.
I think what usually happens after these processes is, that people start to point fingers and say, you should have done this and you should have done that. But I think this is a very important aspect. So everyone was compromising, had to compromise, not what, but everyone had to compromise, sort of. And Albie shaking his head.
I will say this, that there is a curse of
Albie shouting no.
we tend to judge.
No, I'm sorry. Many people compromise, and some compromise a little bit, but overwhelmingly people struggled, they fought, they suffered, they believed, and overwhelmingly, and poor people and ordinary people and generations, and people saw their children going off to fight for freedom. But there were compromise, and I remember actually once a debate. We have these smugglers, people who smuggle liquor and dagga and so on across the borders. They know how to get our MK people through. Should we use them? And some of our people saying, no, we can't use them, even as guides at all. But in terms of money, we got money from Norway and Sweden and from trade unions all over the world. The International Defence and Aid Fund sent in millions of pounds and dollars and so on for defence and so on. And we worked hard for it. It was overwhelmingly an honest and dignified and basically a very clean struggle, led by people like Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu and the others. But we did have violators and crooks in our ranks, and we had people who felt the end justifies the means. But that wasn't the basic philosophy. We don't need to heroicize, if that word exists. And certainly we don't need to triumphalize what happened. But we do need to record and honor the people who were in the overwhelming majority in the struggle in many different political formations, who really believed, who gave up everything, who suffered terrible pains. That was all true. So it's not as though truth inevitably is on the one hand, on the other hand, half and half. You've got to understand and forgive. I agreed with Luando's general point. It wasn't through drugs and smuggling and arms stuff and so on. Overwhelmingly, we got support from honest people throughout the world. And there was huge honest endeavor. And we need more of it. We don't need to trash the examples that were set by whole generations in an earlier period in order to combat and challenge the failures of today.
Just to add that, I think what's tragic for me is that when I look at our public officials today, you look at their freedom fighting credentials and you look at how they're leading today, and it's as if you're looking at two different people. And for me, I don't think that just happened now. I don't think the corruption just started now. I think it's more visible now because we have a free media, but also people are now in charge of the national purse and there's more access, right? So I think it would really benefit us if we spoke about the complexity of the struggle, because I think not having spoken about it or processed it we're seeing very traumatized people leading us today, who haven't worked through their trauma, who don't understand it, who don't understand what it means to have made the decisions that they made when they were fighting for freedom, and now who've been elevated to such important positions. I think if we understood that psyche of what it means to be an oppressed people, I mean, I look at my family, that even just ordinary people who are living under apartheid, living in a capitalistic system, means that you have to participate in it. Even if you know that it's oppressive, you wake up and you live in it, you go to school in it, you work in it, and all those things, that does something to you. And we don't talk about that enough. We think of moral compromises as this big thing. Day-to-day decisions that you make to survive, going to schools that tell you that you're inferior, all those things. I think that seeing it through that lens would really benefit us.
And can I just come back? This is such an important theme. You know, I've just seen Kalushi, the Solomon Mahlangu film, the wonderful film of the guy who was hanged on the common purpose doctrine for an action by Mkhonto Wesizwe. And there were thousands and thousands of Solomon Mahlangus. He represented something real. And what we did in a revolutionary movement, you break away from the world of compromise. And everything you do is dedicated to the struggle. I just read recently Penel Maduna writing about his work as a lawyer on the Constitutional Committee of the ANC. And he said, there we were lawyers. We didn't get a penny for 15 years working with Oliver Tambo. Imagine lawyers not being paid. And there were a whole group. You got a little bit of pocket money at the end of the week. He said, why did we do it? He said, because we didn't want to disappoint Oliver Tambo. It wasn't even you get into trouble. We didn't even say it was our revolutionary consciousness. You didn't want to disappoint Oliver Tambo, the leader. And so there were, how can I say, there isn't an inevitability of corruption. There's inevitability of corruption seeking to penetrate, taking over. Fatigue comes in, new circumstances come in, but the true nobility of the people I was struggling with in the struggle was so profound and so lovely to be part of, and so inspiring. But it came with dread, fear of being assassinated, living all the time waiting to be picked up or blown up or whatever it might be. It came with petty jealousies. It came with some people using their positions in the organization to get sexual favors. Others got drunk. I mean, there were lots and lots of imperfections. But the way I put it myself in those days, when I was so disappointed by the behavior of people in the ANC, the whole was bigger than the parts, was better than the parts. The whole project somehow enabled the honest people, the good people to come together. And the leaders like Oliver Tambo and Chris Hani and Joe Slovo and Walter Sisulu and Ahmed Kathrada and Mama Sisulu and many, many others were very, very good human beings at all levels, at all times. They might have lost their temper or become jealous or exploded or had other human frailties, but the project was a very strong one and a very real one. And for me, it was a blessing to be involved in that movement. I was so used to being involved in organizations that always lost. We lost elections, we were small fringe groups. Suddenly, this fringe idea of a non-racial democratic South Africa became the mainstream of South African life, not with tribal leaders and racial groups sharing power, but a modern, progressive, democratic constitution, a huge achievement. And that achievement embodied the virtue and the honor and the nobility of our struggle. And I say that because there have been huge disappointments. There were great disappointments then. There were times when we felt very, very down, but the whole was greater than the parts. So we acknowledge the parts that are often despicable, but we don't lose sight of the whole. And the real problem comes is when the whole itself is beginning to fragment, and then you're really left in a kind of a limbo.
Thank you, Albie. I just want to come back to that question of ambiguity quickly, because Luando said something very important. So in Taiwan, you have this whole discussion about whether the archives should be fully disclosed or not. Waiting for Shirley Gunn to give a chance to speak. I will give her a chance in 1 second. So in Taiwan, you have this whole discussion whether the archive should be opened or not. And I think Luando just said something very important. She said, we knew. So we knew sort of people who might have been informants. So these were not, this was not information that took people by surprise, is I think what Luando wanted to say. And in Taiwan, where all these informants and perpetrators, where their name are not disclosed yet, they have a much more sort of disruptive potential than they had during the TRC. I think this is one outtake. We can get out of this comparison. Shirley. Shirley. Okay, so now it's your time. We wanted to continue talking a bit. I'm, by the way, very glad our audience has already started asking questions in the Q&A. But let me first come to you, Shirley. So what do you want to talk about? What tasks still remain open today in South Africa?
Well, I would like to firstly pick up on something that Albie raised. Albie looked at 3 committees: Gross Human Rights Violations Committee, the Amnesty Committee, and what was called the R&R Committee, and said that the R&R Committee was was the least successful. So it operated differently from the other 2, but there were seminars that were held on a monthly basis. And I was very fortunate to be drawn into those seminars. And we looked at reparations from multiple angles, from spiritual, cultural, anthropological, psychological, medical. We looked at Chile, we looked at other countries, and we looked at what could inform our reparations strategy. And if you look at the reparations in its holistic form that was recommended by the TRC, probably very much less that the community that I was involved in at the time would have asked for. But if you look at those holistic recommendations, they were solid. And they don't only talk about monetary reparations. And we were totally insulted, actually, in 2003, when our Minister of Finance said that we were not involved in the struggle for money. And in fact, it wasn't that the TRC had suggested so little. It was the government of the day that had suggested so little, 1/5 of what the TRC had recommended. But that was not all. It was not only about monetary reparations. There was community reparations. There was health. There was housing. There was education. Today, 23 years later, there's no policy regarding housing or health. Education, there was a policy that was developed. Very, very, very few people in the closed list. And here's one of the problems that Albie raised, the closed list. And those identified by the TRC, 22,000 of them, 22,000 plus, a little bit more, of which only 2,000 we know as a collective memory of South Africa, because only 2,000 were actually public. The rest were written and are in archives, not very well organized, but they're in archives. So the country, the world, that TV that Luando was talking about, the radio programs, everyone knows just a fraction of the whole. So, the failure of the reparations recommendations was the failure of the South African state. And it wasn't Nelson Mandela and our first Minister of Justice. It was the second president, Thabo Mbeki, and the second Justice Minister really had a very important hand in this to ensure that the recommendations of the TRC were followed through. I look at those recommendations and they dotted right throughout the 7 volumes. And in volume 5, chapter 8 is the recommendation around reconciliation. And in the TRC report recommended was that before the turn of the century, in 1999, the South African government should call a national summit on reparations, on reconciliation, bring the nation together, discuss all these blurry areas that we've been talking about for the first hour of this webinar. Have this conversation, get us together. That didn't happen. It didn't happen to this day. And ironically, 23 years later, I say with tears in my eyes, we are asking the South African government for a summit on reparations because they've failed so dismally in putting together policy and making sure that those who suffered the extremities, the atrocities of the apartheid regime are actually somehow supported with a house that was destroyed, a house with health needs, people lost limbs and so many things, and education bursaries. And so all of that is what we see as reparations and community reparations. Oh, that's another saga. And very important. So the Justice Department, and let me say that the TRC actually recommended that this TRC unit would fall within the President's office, not the Justice Department's office, because all of these aspects of reparations had to be coordinated. And the President's office was the best one to see to housing, health, education, etc., the broader holistic reparation package, not the Justice Minister, who we nearly sat with a blanket amnesty because in the second presidency, Thabo Mbeki's era, there was an absolute suspension of further investigation on all those cases that were presented post the TRC to the National Prosecuting Officer for further investigation and prosecution. It was stopped. And it's because of the power of the people still today that we have risen up and we've challenged those in power to ensure that we can dig up and continue with investigation. So now the MPA has got its act together, sort of, and is pursuing 97 matters, TRC matters. Good. It wouldn't have happened without us. And it took 140 veterans of the struggle to camp outside in the cold at the Constitutional Hill to raise the matter of reparations. Have we got a tone-deaf state? We have to go to such lengths, and it seems that we do. So we'll continually struggle. And, just in terms of struggle, Luanda, I am actually a freedom fighter. I was in the ranks of Umkhonto we Sizwe, Albie knows, and I don't see that there's been I'm still in the struggle. I'm still in the trench. I'm still earning peanuts. I'm still fighting the cause. There doesn't seem to be a huge turning point in my life and many others that I know and am associated with, proudly. And we are very glad that we've got the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice, made up of 12 organizations at this stage, some big, some small, some legal, some non-legal, some grassroots, some higher up ones, and individuals who are championing all of these things, that we don't have torture in our detention facilities, that we do have accountability, and that there are some people that didn't get amnesty and failed to apply are investigated and prosecuted, and that there is adequate reparations in its broad, holistic sense, and not within the closed list. So, because lots of people were actually excluded, and that there needs to be an open and honest and fair process to include some more people who were excluded. So, I think I've said a little bit on over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Shirley. So we have today a very activistic and even, yeah, I understand you. There is actually, I will ask one more questions until I go asking questions from our Q&A. But there's actually a very interesting anecdote about the sort of logic behind the government's reparation or missing reparations. Luando might be a victim of load shedding. That's why she left. Unfortunately, this is what happens in South Africa as well. But Shirley, I mentioned this earlier in a private conversation, and I found the thing. It's on page 286 in Country of My Skull. And Anki has a conversation with the then Minister of Finance, who reiterated the same sentiment. Even if we take everything that whites have, it will not be enough to make up for the past. And then Anki very furiously replies, what are you saying then? Should whites continue living as selfishly and greedily as they want, because whatever they do will never be enough? And what the then Minister of Finance answered to this, he cited, no, I guess what I'm saying is that there is no plan to get from whites what they owe to us. To really change the lives of the poor, we need a growth rate of 6%. So is maybe one reason why there were so little reparations, this realization that in a country where poverty is at the core of the societies, is the core problem of the society, no reparations can do substantial change for the society as a whole, but you need economic development. Do you think is this sort of what the government was thinking at the time?
I think the TRC had advocated for a wealth tax. That wasn't followed through. I was actually quite moved by the music that you were playing at the beginning of this webinar and the image that we had in front of us, which shows our Gini coefficient, the largest in the world, the gap between the rich and the poor, and it's very, very much demonstrated in Anastasia's image. So this is not what we fought for. This is not where we far from where we should be. I think the systemic corruption happened during apartheid. It continues, and we have to have prosecutions. There has to be a diligence. There has to be a rule of law in this country. We've got to fight for that. So I think the one thing really is that it's not only white, it's about the wealth. Mostly white, but not totally white. The wealth, there should be a higher tax, wealth tax, and that should have been imposed a long time ago.
I think I need to give our audience also a chance to ask their questions. So we have a similar questions from two, actually they are our speakers, Dominic Young and Jimmy Xu. Jimmy Xu will be in the final discussion. And in Taiwan, there's this whole discussion about the cultural aspect of transitional justice. So there are people, and not only in Taiwan, Anki Krog was also for a very long time a sort of promoter of that concept that this way of the TRC and the way of reconciliation in South Africa would have been impossible without happening in the context of Ubuntu. And then there are other people who say this type of South African reconciliation would have been impossible in a country where not the majority of the population is Christian, because this concept of reconciliation is actually a religious concept. And therefore, the TRC could only work in South Africa because of the influence of Ubuntu and because of the influence of Christian theology. What is your take on this question? Were cultural aspects, did they play any role during the process?
I don't know.
Who were you asking?
Yeah. I think, Albie, there you go.
I think it was an enormous support for the process. And it was wonderful having Desmond Tutu. He knows when to wear his religious attire. And they would start with hymns and to make people feel comfortable, but it wasn't the origin of it. The origin was the way I've mentioned. I happen to be very secular myself, and I'm not even a secular Christian, I'm a secular Jew. So it didn't come. And in my case, it wasn't forgiveness. In my case, I met the man who put the bomb in my car that cost me my arm and sight in one eye. And I didn't feel I was forgiving him. I felt I was transcending him. That's what I call my soft vengeance. Getting democracy, getting freedom. Sending him to jail wasn't going to restore my arm. Getting compensation would have actually trivialized my loss of an arm because it would have placed it in the marketplace. But getting freedom, getting liberation, wow, it made my life so rich and so worthwhile. Now, I can say that because I'm able to earn a decent income and I'm not suffering from the marginalization exclusions that the majority of the population had. But I feel there was something involved here. There's also a very important factor, the pure pragmatics of prosecutions. Where would you get the evidence? You'd have the courts held up for years with appeals, and we wanted to use all our enterprise and energy to liberate, to transform, to emancipate, rather than to have getting some of the crooks to testify against others, you give them amnesty. That was a pragmatic foundation. So the fact that Desmond Tutu was such a marvelous leader, and he framed it as forgiveness. Forgiveness, as people pointed out, the state can't forgive. The families might or might not forgive. It wasn't even a condition for getting amnesty. So I find that that's not, to my mind, persuasive, but it is persuasive as to why the TRC at the time, as Luanda brought out so beautifully, had such an enormous impact. It was the impact not only of confession, but you've been sitting with your pain. You couldn't even speak about it. It was being denied. And there's nothing worse than harshness that you've experienced. Its very existence is being denied. And as Luanda pointed out, the people could cry openly and express themselves openly. And I think that was more important than the theological statements and presentations of somebody like Desmond Tutu.
Shirley, do you want to add something?
Yes, just very briefly. To add on, I did have the occasion to meet one of the people responsible for the torture that I was subjected to, and my son, Adrian Flook. He was the Minister of Law and Order at the time in apartheid, and he said he wanted to wash my feet, and I said no, no. You can wash my feet when I'm the last South African in the queue whose feet you wash. And I think if I had the opportunity again, I would say the same. And it came from a biblical line because he became very religious, and that was also his journey. He also filled his little lorry with veggies and dropped it off at people in Mamelodi, I think. On a monthly basis. He tried in his terms to make amends, just to acknowledge that. And then the question of, forgiveness, maybe the flip is apology. Our Truth Commission didn't actually didn't demand or require apology. And that was because if you did something with political conviction, you did it because you were politically convicted, and you had no need to apologize. You had to prove that what you did was politically motivated. So there wasn't an insistence on apology, and I think the notion of forgiveness is taken to its extreme, and it shouldn't be.
So there's for the scholars in our panel, there's actually one book that looks at this question from I think he's actually a Danish guy called Christian Gate, and the book is called A Discourse in African Philosophy, A New Perspective on Ubuntu and Transitional Justice in South Africa. And what Gate sort of did is he downloaded 10,000 documents from the TRC website and looked at how much Ubuntu is mentioned in these documents. And he found out it's only mentioned 50 times. So there's one interpretation in South Africa that says Ubuntu was used to, code this apologetic process in a nice moral wrapping and say we all need to coexist. And then, so this is sort of one extreme. People were deceived into reconciling, which is obviously wrong. And then there's another extreme that says the TRC would have been impossible without Ubuntu. And Christian Gay looks at this and says, okay, if it's only mentioned in 50 times in those 10,000 documents, then it doesn't make sense to call it propaganda. And it also doesn't make sense to call it to be at the center of the TRC. What he concludes is that this sort of focus on Ubuntu only came after the TRC, when people started to make sense of the TRC, and they started then to say, oh, this must be because of this, deep influence of African philosophy, or this must be because of this deep influence of theology. One more phrase, Albie, and sort of the role on religion. I think the same goes for religion. What we might say is that this religious language of reconciliation might have, played a facilitating role to make this process more acceptable, more facilitating it, but not being at the core. Okay, Albie, please.
Now, just to say, Ubuntu was mentioned in the Constitution only once, in the interim Constitution. Yeah. An epilogue was added at the end. We call it the post-amble. And it said we must come to terms with the untold, unspeakable, that word wasn't used, but the crimes of the past. But we must do so not in a spirit of vengeance and retaliation, but in a spirit of Ubuntu and reconciliation. And many people were saddened that the word Ubuntu didn't make it into the final constitution and didn't become an African foundation for our whole Bill of Rights. And some of us as judges incorporated Ubuntu into interpreting our Bill of Rights, not as some classical liberal document imported from the United States, but something that emerged from the solidarity, human solidarity that Shirley and I knew in the resistance, in the underground struggle, as being the basis of the freedom that we achieved afterwards. So Ubuntu was there. It wasn't widely used in South African discourse, and it came to be used afterwards increasingly because it picked up on something that freedom doesn't do. Freedom is allowing you to get ahead, make money, be rich, aggrandize yourself, take advantage of all opportunities without the fraternity, sorority, the human interconnection. And Ubuntu comes closer to the human dignity, which now became, if you like, prior to freedom, and not freedom as a substitute for human dignity. I just wanted to throw in that it was mentioned once, that was more important than the 60 times in actually justifying the setting up of the Truth Commission by the new democratic government.
The way how Gay puts it, it's not, we should not say South Africans chose reconciliation because of Ubuntu, but he says people chose Ubuntu because it fitted their socio-economic interests. And then in the foreword, his mentor writes, Ubuntu is a method that empowers us to become actors, agents, and subjects of history, and not only objects of history. So I think this, idea of the TRC was only possible because of Ubuntu is as convincing as some scholars say Taiwan cannot be democratic because it's influenced by Confucianism.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's so moving that in Canada, where there's no Ubuntu and there's no Confucius, they're having a Truth Commission now to deal with painful treatment of the indigenous people plucked away from their families and put in schools to civilize them. So there's something universal in dealing with trauma, where the trauma was induced by whole sections of society disregarding other whole sections of society in very violent, wretched ways that are incompatible with our values today. And then if you want to take from one country to another, what are those elements of humanizing human behavior that are transportable? We got a lot from Chile, but our Truth Commission is completely different to the Chilean one, and the Taiwanese should be completely different. Can I just say just one thing? When I said no neutrality, it didn't mean you can be biased. I'm saying neutrality, you're not neutral on the values.
Yes.
You don't say, oh, well, a little bit of torture is okay, or a little bit of racism. You're very passionate and committed, but you are impartial. You are biased in favor of the values, not in favor of people or political formations or political parties. And in that sense, our Truth Commission, partly because of its diverse composition, and partly people were chosen, they weren't political actors with political ambitions, I think did remarkably well in all the different sectors. And as Shirley said, the political actors and a later generation put all the eggs in the basket of economic progress, a better life for everybody. We don't need the special remedies. And I think it was done in a heartless way. It was done in a way that didn't take account of particular pockets of pain that had been revealed that could have been dealt with. And it wasn't done in a way that didn't just leave it to government and the amorphous economy to bring about change, compelled the wealthy, the communities to engage with their continuing privilege and benefits and to give something that made them better human beings, better South Africans. I think that was a failure then, and it's a failure today.
There's one more question in our chat that relates to something you said, Albie, earlier. So we spend a lot of time, and I think that's very valid criticism, talking about the moral ambiguity of the ANC while not condemning apartheid enough in this panel. And sort of you talked about that. I think this is also one of the major criticisms of the TRC, right? That the TRC did not deal with structural issues, but only with the human rights violations. So why could the leaders of apartheid not be put into prison after apartheid?
All right. Maybe Shirley wants to have a go.
Go for it. Sorry, I was just distracted for a moment by a question. Yes, sorry.
Tackle sort of
let me answer then, Shirley, because I was focusing on this. Yeah. The TRC had a very specific remit. It wasn't the job of the TRC to introduce democracy, to transform the economy. Apartheid was a crime against humanity. That was given. The whole non-racial, non-sexist constitution was the weapon, the instrument for big radical change. That was in the background. It's that constitution that created space for the TRC. And the TRC was to deal with the hidden violations, things that were crimes even under apartheid law, the tortures, the excruciating forms of assassination and repression, because they were so ugly and so violent. If there was denial of those things, it would keep alive a sense of two histories in South Africa. So in that sense, it was helping to rewrite the story of the country and to allow people, as Luanda brought out so vividly, even to this young girl, access to the emotions of pain, of being able to speak your pain, of being heard, of being listened to, of being recognized, of being acknowledged as real human beings. And it had to do that and do that well. As it happens, the report, as Shirley has pointed out, was very comprehensive. It went outside their remit. It did deal with structural issues. It did make all sorts of recommendations. So it can't be faulted for not touching on those aspects. It wasn't its function to do that. And if it had done that, it might have allowed insufficient attention on the torturers, the killers, the assassins, and the things that were so violent and so particularly ugly. And I would imagine in a country like Taiwan, it's not simply the KMT regime in general that's been criticized. It was the people who were tortured. It was the people who were isolated. It was the newspapers that were closed down. It's focusing on the way the authoritarian society maintained itself in existence. It wasn't a challenge to the authoritarian society as such. And it's such a sadness for me that one of the commissioners couldn't step back and look at it as a national problem in Taiwan, couldn't step away from immediate political advantage, couldn't step away from a chance, now it's our turn, we're exposing them, and open up his heart to, these things happen, people did it, we're so glad the story's being told, we mustn't allow it to happen again, but the truth must come out. It wasn't seamless, and lots of our parents and grandparents paid the price for belonging to indigenous people, paid the price for being in the opposition, worked in the underground, were subjected to all sorts of abuses. We want that recognized as part of our national project. And it's all messed up because of one stupid guy thinking with contemporary political advantage and not getting to the breadth and the warmth and the integrity, if you like, of what the project should have been.
Speaking for a lot of Taiwanese scholars who are rather disappointed with the undertaking of transitional justice in Taiwan. Shirley, let me ask you a question, which is related to something Albie just said, which has to do with history. So there is sort of this idea that the TRC report you read was the foundation of a sort of consensus on at least some points of South African history. Now, I would like to ask you, is there a consensus today in South Africa on how to evaluate F.W. de Klerk? And is there even a consensus in South Africa today on how to evaluate Mandela?
You do throw interesting questions at us. Firstly, I haven't read the 7 volumes from cover to cover. And
I want to know the person who did.
even as with the benefit of a social science degree, I would appreciate a summarized version and even one that was more pictorial so that more people could understand the depth of this report. And that is outstanding still. So back to your question, which was?
Is there a consensus in South Africa today on how to evaluate FW and Mandela?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag, because there was an outcry just before FW de Klerk died last year. He said that apartheid was not a crime against humanity. Oh, by the way, South Africa has not yet signed the Apartheid Convention. Keep that in your mind. And there was an outcry. And then his foundation softened the tone of his statement and maybe I would say backtracked. But isn't that amazing that a former head of state and a Nobel Peace Prize winner could utter such nonsense? Secondly, when you think of Nelson Mandela and we think of our 9-foot bronze statue, which we have in many places across the country, well, that one is, the very big one is at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, but we've got many streets and very many memorials and monuments to Nelson Mandela. I think the statement and the remembrance is not that he was a freedom fighter, not that he was a member of Umkhonto we Sizwe, like myself, but that he was a Nobel Peace Prize winner. So the narrative does shift over time, doesn't it? And lest we forget He comes from the trench. He was prepared to give his life. He did. So many years serve in prison for his ideals. But he didn't renounce the armed struggle. So why do we only recall one side of his personality? Let's not make that mistake.
Yeah, I'm very sad that Luando fell victim to the power outage. But there is, especially with the younger, population in South Africa, this idea that Mandela was a seller, a so-called seller. Shirley, could you talk a bit about this perception?
That he was a sell out?
That
he sold us out?
Yes.
In this kind of transitional, that very paper that you were talking about, the Danish academic, I actually got to read some of those chapters, and it described different forms of transition. And we had that half-baked one where we sit with the enemy for the first 5 years or 4 years, first term, that it was a transition that was, I don't have my notes on here because I'm in a different place, at the Holocaust Center, not at my office. But that it was a bit of a compromised transition. It wasn't a straight cut from one system to another. We had that interim phase of the former and the incoming working together side by side, and it was very difficult. It was a very difficult time. I think Nelson Mandela navigated that very sensitively, because he had securocrats and he had bureaucrats that were undermining our transition going forward. So I wouldn't really say Mandela was a sellout, but I would say that there've been some other sellouts along the way beyond him. In positions of power, even presidencies.
Yeah. So what I think Luando could have talked a bit about is that this disappointment, especially by the younger people, led to this picture of Mandela being a sellout. But what he tried to do was just find the right balance for the country to move into the right direction. And I think Albie would not agree to call Mandela a seller.
We speak about Black leaders being erased from history. And now we're getting young Black people erasing our own leaders. And he was tremendous. He was passionate. He was fiery. Even on Robben Island, he fought and fought and fought all the way through. And he came out and he was a wonderful public face. But the story is he did a deal with the capitalists, give us the vote and you have the economy. And it was so far from the truth. He was a great listener. And I think what was important for him was all the Afro-pessimists in the world were waiting for chaos. What happens when Black people take over the reins of government? Everything goes to pot. And he was very eager to show that democracy actually can benefit the whole of society, but there has to be forward movement. And I heard from somebody who was in the cabinet, I won't mention names, in the government of national unity. This person said, I never thought I would ever feel sorry for F.W. de Klerk. He hated de Klerk. But sometimes Mandela was so rude to him, I found myself even feeling sorry for de Klerk. and the two issues were, the one was sending George Bezos to go to the Constitutional Court to argue against capital punishment. And de Klerk said, but this is a government of national unity, we work by consensus. And Mandela said, Bezos is going. He was just rude, he wasn't even nice. And the other, I was told, was when I was nominated to be a judge on the court. And de Klerk was totally against it. And Mandela just swept him aside. These are the two examples I know of. And he could actually be very tough. He'd been a boxer once upon a time. And every now and then that old pugilist would come out when at Codesa, he pointed his finger at the Klerk and said, "This man is not to be trusted." I was very shocked at that time, but he spoke out quite clearly. There was jubilation in the townships. What is sad is people have niceified Mandela, Mr. Nice Guy, and it's the Nobel Prize winner, the reconciler, the negotiator, Mr. Nice Guy, who makes everybody feel comfortable. And that was at the tail end of his life, at a moment when it was important for democracy not to be associated with chaos, for black rule not to imply that nothing functions, nothing works anymore. And he fulfilled that role well, but it was the last chapter in a long life, and a long life of a militant, of a revolutionary, of a fighter, of a thinker, of somebody who never gave up. He is one of humanity's heroes, one of, and there were many others of his own generation who ought to be extolled for that. But if we don't tell those stories, if people don't know those stories, they only see Mr. Nice Guy held up by the whites as that lovely champion of their interests, and they get a very wrong impression.
I think these are the perfect words to end our discussion today. I thank our three speakers for having this very interesting discussion. I think some people wrote in the chat, I think we Taiwanese learned a lot today. Yeah, I'm also very happy that I had the chance to speak to the three of you. I hope that future projects can emerge from this and that we can have more of these meaningful discussions in the future. Thank you to everyone, and also thank you to our audience for asking so many very interesting and relevant questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Shirley.
Goodbye, Albie. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alex. Very well done.
Bye, Albie. Oh yes, I forgot to tell that we will have another event next week. We will talk about Germany, so save the date.